It is now my delight and pleasure to introduce our guest speakers. Let me first start with Senator Pamela Wallin, who really requires no introduction at all. She's someone whose voice and image is known in every corner of this country. She was the voice of CBC's As It Happens, the face of Canada AM, was a national news co-host with Peter Mansbridge. Pamela Wallin is an internationally celebrated journalist. She is probably the only Canadian senator with a street named after her. She has no less, and I was corrected this morning, she has no less than 14 honorary doctorates and is a member of the Order of Canada. Prior to being appointed to the Senate, Pamela Wallin served our country as the Canadian Consul General to New York. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. and Senator, the Honorable Pamela Wallin. Our main guest of honor is a man that has spent the last 35 years as a hero to many. He has literally saved lives. He humbly served our country like many of our members of the diplomatic corps. But in Ambassador Taylor's case, he went above and beyond. Since his retirement from diplomacy, Ken has served on many corporate boards, including Nabisco and Norvista Resources. Ambassador Taylor is truly Canadian. He is a member of the Order of Canada and received the U.S. Congressional Gold Medal. He has spent his entire career with his ear to the ground and is an expert in international relations, diplomacy, and world affairs. Ken Taylor knows Canada, and he knows Canadians. Unlike many, he understands the soul of our country and its role on the world stage. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Ambassador Ken Taylor.
Well, this is a bit of a thrill. I've got to confess that I first met Ken, I think, in 1981. I was a young reporter. Pierre Trudeau, then Prime Minister, was in New York. Ken was talk of the town, and I was a lowly reporter in the background watching these two men on the international stage. And Ken indeed was on the international stage as not only our man in Tehran, but America's man in Tehran and the world's man in Tehran, with the kind of courage and dedication that he showed. So Ken and I have been talking about this, what we're going to do today, and it is to talk about this story that for many has faded from memory. For a younger generation, they may not know it at all. And then a movie comes along called Argo. And it gives us a chance to celebrate this man again, and I think correct the record. The one thing you... I was watching yesterday as Hillary Clinton, the U.S. Secretary of State, was being grilled on the death of 4 American diplomats in Benghazi. And at one point she said, in trying to explain to one of her questioners, well, didn't you see Argo? Like, don't you know how this works? And I did not know whether to laugh or cry. And I kind of opted for crying, that this is how we would start to understand our history. Ken, when you look at those situations today and you see a Secretary of State citing a movie, how do you react?
Well, I think that first we've got to go back to that day in New York.
Oh, no.
The Prime Minister's there. I'm in the background, and I look around. There's the press and what have you, and there's a very attractive young woman, stylish hat. And I'm thinking, I hope she asks me a question. So that was a while ago. And of course, then Pamela's been a distinguished time as Consul General in New York. And at that time, I reflect upon a few years I did have in New York myself, and I think back and I say, if only I would have done then that Pamela does now. So it's difficult when you're one of your successors outdoes and achieves what you'd hope to aspire to yourself. But again, Pamela, back to your question, I think what happens with the movie Argo, I mean, I know it has something to do with Greek mythology, but I always thought it was about football team. That's all that matters. Again, a use of poetic license by Hollywood. I think what comes back to really, and I think the senators who were asking the question missed almost entirely the point, is that unless you have a host government who is prepared to come and reinforce the security you have inside the embassy, the game's over. I thought the questions at the Secretary of State were maybe legitimate. I didn't think they were very fair. And on top of that, if you remember, Pamela, after Ambassador Pickering and Admiral Mullen did a quick investigation of what happened in Benghazi, the State Department did adopt 27 different measures which I think have a chance of working. But really, when you think of being a Foreign Service officer in that dangerous neighborhood, there's no solution, no matter what the embassy does. If the mob decides to storm the embassy and the host government doesn't have any recourse, is you hope for the best.
You went into this post as a relatively young Foreign Service officer. You had a young son. He was fortunately, I think, for you away at school, but had to come back at Christmas. Did you have any idea at the time? I mean, you went in and the Shah was there and things seemed pretty predictable. But it wasn't long before the seeds of this revolution were growing. And with the work that you did, particularly for the Americans, and agreeing to provide some information and eventually to house their hostages or potential hostages, did you even have any idea of the risk?
Yeah, I think we gauged it, but I'm thinking back to when I first arrived. Again, the Shah in power, a relatively tranquil country, very sophisticated, very cosmopolitan, at least in Tehran. And then I'm thinking back, and you try to recapture those days. I can't do much about the color of my hair. Do you remember Grecian formula? That was I think. But the one thing I was going through one of my drawers the other day, and I thought, well, maybe I can recapture that when maybe I was younger somewhat than I am now. So I came across a pair of glasses that I wore. So I thought I'd...
Now we recognize you.
I mean, it's they sort of, I guess they worked.
They were really awful.
I thought they were the answer at the moment. See. And,
but you think about that. I mean, the one thing that the movie did do well was capture the tension that was at that moment. What they did not capture was your role and what you were prepared
well,
to put on
I
the
think
line.
that the Canadian Embassy in its entirety, and also that is forgotten in this, is all the work that was done in Ottawa. With respect to Tehran, there were really three focal points: one Washington, one Ottawa, and one Tehran. And so much was done by my colleagues in Ottawa, not only on giving and taking with the CIA and the State Department, but also making these Americans Canadian. Now, where do you start?
It's a long road.
I have some friends from Philadelphia here, and I'm not entirely certain. Maybe I'd like Bill's advice as to what you do to an American citizen suddenly to transform him, as if by magic, into a Canadian. I guess you start with the accent. But after that, you need papers. And what the colleagues in Ottawa did is, what do you find in your pockets in a normal day? So there were business cards, credit cards, maybe a black book, other identification that makes up a person's persona. And that was all done professionally, exquisitely, and given to the U.S. diplomats. And one way or the other, either by osmosis with these documents, they suddenly became Canadian. The movie looks at it from a Los Angeles, Hollywood point of view, focused largely on Langley, the CIA. And though we Canadians were delighted to work with the professionalism and resourcefulness and courage of the CIA officers, the CIA really, quite frankly, and I say this, of course, to a partial audience, were a player, but the second-tier player. Whereas in the movie, I think it comes over that certainly myself, I was very gifted at opening and closing a door.
The innkeeper.
Yeah, the innkeeper. I mean,
Yeah.
I suddenly saw myself, I'd been in an hotel recently, and I looked at the concierge, and I say, I've done that job. So there was
Not to mention that Victor Garber was way too old to be playing you at the time.
Yeah, well,
Okay.
he as I say, my hair was somewhat of a different hue, but I was maybe roughly early 40s.
Right.
And as you say, arrived with a fair amount of ambition, whereas Victor, a polished and professional actor, is somewhat older than that. But I thought he brought an air of maturity that I was missing at the time when I was in Tehran.
But just can you walk us through it? And I know for you this is what you've lived, but I do think it's important that people understand what you went through, what Pat was doing. Your wife, she was out working, trying to work in the city. Very world-renowned researcher and working in blood services at the time. A young son, knowing that if you took any of this on, your life was at risk. Relations between Canada and Tehran were at risk. Knowing that other allies there and present had said no, and that you were the only one stepping up.
Well, I think as most of you know, the first call from the U.S. diplomats was to my colleague John Sheardown, who tentatively extended a welcome, but it was something that we had to check with Ottawa, of course. And that happened. We set out to Ottawa that this was our intention, and Ottawa quickly, Prime Minister Joe Clark, without hesitation, and Flora MacDonald, who was Secretary of State, came back quickly and assured us that we had their full support. I think the risk we took were sort of minimized in the sense that the country was in a total case of chaos. It was revolution, there were no police, there was no army, there was no government, period. And so that gives you a fair amount of liberty of movement.
But you had Iranian staff living in your home. You didn't know what side they were on.
They were, didn't ask Pat, sort of my wife handled that aspect. She told them that the two staying with us were on a vacation. A month later, one of our staff, just a fine young man, came up and said, "Madam," he said, "they're on vacation, but they don't seem very curious. They haven't been out of the house for a month." And then, "Why are they wearing some of Mr. Taylor's clothes?" She said, "Well, you know, you travel light." But Pat and herself, John and Zena had the, Sheardown had the other four. But Pat, of course, was busy herself. She was at the Iranian Blood Transfusion Service, and then she was giving lectures at the University of Tehran postgraduate medical school, and then also consulting at the Pasteur Institute. I saw her once or twice every month. But the sitting at the Iranian Blood Transfusion Service was quite a story, because the Iranian Blood Transfusion Service was located in the middle of Tehran, and Faridun and Farouk, you know where the location is. And that was the heart of the revolution. Yeah. And so, and both sides, whether you're a revolutionary, whether you're a soldier, whether you're rioting, you all need blood. So even though Pat was on the research side, the building was all together. So one day the door bursts open, and some of the demonstrators, revolutionaries, rioters come in, said, "We need white coats." So they were on a rack, they put on the white coats, they busied themselves. In comes the soldiers. Where are the revolutionaries? By this time, they just kept on their white coat, and then eventually went out the back door. Then the soldiers, as they're prone to do, started shooting in the air, and then Pat reminded them that there may be people upstairs. That was a typical day in Tehran. And so it was Douglas, our son, who came to Tehran, who many of you know now. He's I guess what you'd call a young, mature man. But at that stage, he was about 14 and went to the French lycée. The first month it was good. Then the Khomeini government said that they can't have a school mixed and that it was a foreign school. They'd have to close for a month. So they closed for a month. They started again, closed again because there was a threat they would blow up the school. So as a young 14 or 15-year-old, remember that stage of your own life. 3 months vacation. This is wonderful. But it soon became clear to him that he was going to lose a year. So we sent him to southern France, where there was a boarding school. And then comes Christmas, and we had our 2 American house guests, and so we said, Douglas, here's a ticket back. And Douglas says, fine. So I met him at the airport, and I said, by the way, we have 2 friends staying with us, and 2 American diplomats. And he said, why aren't they locked up in the compound? I said, well, they got out. So they had a good time together. They played a game called Persepolis. It was a game similar to Monopoly, except it had oil derricks. And instead of Park Avenue, it was Kuwait, and what have you. So hour after hour, they'd play Persepolis. I think they knew the region geographically quite well, Pamela. But of course, it was the other element to it is that the Canadian embassy, my colleagues, were in just as much jeopardy as I was. And when it came time to narrow down the staff, I said to them that, well, look, it's too bad, you have to go back. They said, no, we don't want to go back. We want to stay here until this is finished. And I think that's very typical of the nature and character of Canadians overseas, whether they be in the military, whether they be in the diplomatic corps. And it was really emblematic, I think, of particularly for the students here from Victoria University and from Ryerson, that you may want to, as an aside to, as I'm talking about, that consider the public service, consider diplomacy. It's a good game, an odd game, but a good game.
When Robert's book came out, and we're really pleased to have Robert right here with us today, and if you have watched the movie Argo, go and buy this book, and then you will know what actually happened, because I don't know how many of you know this, but Argo premiered at the Toronto Film Festival. And if any of you have seen it subsequently, you will know that at the end of the film, there's a crawl on the screen that says, we'd like to offer our thanks to the Canadian government and the Canadian people, and that is because Ken, when he saw the movie, phoned Ben Affleck and said, that's the least you can bloody do, is put it on the screen and thank not Ken Taylor, but thank the Canadian government and its people for what they were prepared to risk. But this is the definitive version, and there is kind of a, where's that opening quote that I want to find here? An ambassador that Robert uses. An ambassador is a man who, Robert, help me out with the quote. You know what it is. Where is? Exactly. An ambassador is a man of virtue who is sent abroad to lie for his country. It's great. Were you a spy in the sense that we think of it?
Well, I think a friend of mine said the other day, he said, well, you're certainly not James Bond. And he said, I think you're more like Austin Powers. So I said, just wait till I wear my velvet suit. But the U.S., you must recall, found itself at the end of the revolution or during the revolution without any presence, any diplomats, any CIA agents, no one who penetrated any part of Iranian society. And I think what happened is President Carter asked Prime Minister Clark that the U.S. were contemplating some sort of commando raid called Eagle Claw, but they didn't have any intelligence. So they were wondering if this is something that the Canadian embassy would do. And this was really classified, very classified, but Robert, being the historian and investigative reporter, which he doesn't say he is, but and I'm sure you're the dean of your school would be curious about that too. But he is a marvelous political science history, uncovered this. And of course, there's the documents. He had the documents, he had the letter, and what have you. So it became part of the book. And what the president asked is that Sergeant Edwards, military police officer from Canada, who was assigned to our embassy as one of 8 military police to monitor the crowd of people every day who were seeking Canadian citizenship, be assigned to do some intelligence about the U.S. Embassy. That is, how would the walls be breached? How many people are in the embassy holding the U.S. diplomats? What are their habits? And then they asked if a CIA officer could be assigned to the embassy as well. And fine. And Sergeant Edwards was there already. And then one day, the receptionist said, there's a representative from the U.S. government to see you. And it was, of course, the CIA agent. He introduced himself as Bob. I worked with him for 2 months and never did know his last name.
Or his first.
Or his first. Well, Bob was convenient. And both Bob and Sergeant Edwards did remarkable work. I was quite secure back at the embassy. They were the ones who, for almost a month and a half, looked at the embassy. Where would the troops, the commandos, breach the gate? What would they find inside? A remarkable piece of work, which each day was sent via Ottawa to whoever in Washington was going to read this. One day, at about 10 o'clock at night, as Robert describes in his book,
after you were finished serving supper to the...
As we were sitting around in a melancholy sort of mood, just after I promised them that they'd be home by the Super Bowl, that Sergeant Edwards is being held in the U.S. Embassy. I said, well, so I went down to the embassy, and of course, this spelled disaster. And not only would, if Sergeant Edwards was persuaded through interrogation techniques, though I doubted he would, but that's a possibility, about his own efforts on gathering intelligence, and then also the 6. So everything was open to exposure. It looked as if it was going to fall apart. But in the meantime, Jean Peltier, an enterprising young journalist with La Presse, 2 months ago, previous, had found out that, in fact, there were 6 U.S. diplomats at Luce, and he thought that they were in the Canadian embassy, or the premises. He then went to the Canadian embassy and asked point blank. And the officer at the Canadian embassy, as Pamela suggested, 1 lie a day and you feel better. Said, well, maybe, maybe not, maybe, what have you. And La Presse then were persuaded not to run the story. And they agreed to not run the story. But in anticipation of that, I rented a villa down the street from our villa with high walls and what have you, knowing that if we had 20 minutes lead time, we could easily move the U.S. diplomats down the street, and then the Iranians could come and say, we have nobody here.
A safe house.
A safe house, yeah. So I had that in mind as a possibility. So Sergeant Edwards was with a girlfriend, an Iranian, and they were both taken into the embassy compound. As he said, I'm just looking at graffiti. They went in and they started to interrogate him, and he said to his friend, because they were talking in Farsi, tell me when I'm in trouble. So after an hour, she said in English, you're in trouble. Then, miraculously, he talked his way out. And one way or the other explained that he was pro-revolution. He was interpreting the graffiti why would you apprehend him? So he, as I say, quite remarkably, with guile, he found his way back to the embassy. He came in at, say, 1 in the morning and said, I said, well, we're happy to see you. He said, yeah, I'm fine, you know. It was a rigorous 3 hours. He said, but I'm here, and I'm all set to go tomorrow morning. I said, well, you're all set to go tomorrow morning to the airport because here's a ticket to Tokyo. So he left that next day, and Sergeant Edwards then did receive, again, as in the book, in a secret ceremony, the highest, one of the Canadian military's highest decorations and medals for the work that he did, which received really no recognition until just recently.
So you'll remember about, I don't know, 6 or 7 minutes ago, my question was, were you a spy? Really interesting story. I think the answer is yes.
So, you know, we all look back at throughout Pamela's career. I mean, and I say you've heard this so often, Pamela, that most of us in this room woke up with you every morning. And I'm sure one once knows that once Pamela pierces in on a question or wants the answer, is you don't have a chance, particularly in front of 300 witnesses. But the definition of the word or what have you is I was gathering intelligence. Right. For at the request of the Canadian government, who in turn were asked for it by the U.S. government. And however you define that, right, is Pamela, you know, you're articulate. You can come up with one word or another.
Find another word. What's amazing, I think, listening to a lot of this stuff today, and it's hard to you know, in today's media world, this wouldn't happen, that this story, your communications with Ottawa, you weren't on the BlackBerry. This was old teletype and telex. That if a journalist found this out, that you could talk to them and say, please don't leak this story. It probably couldn't happen today. No.
I think, well, again, Pamela, that's your profession. And I believe you're right, that the press, here's a big story, agreed, ironclad agreement not to say anything about this story, except they said the minute we feel that it has broken is we're running it. And the other, for those of you who are working internationally these days and this and that, the other one of your thoughts triggers a bit of a recollection that I think if in those days I was in Tehran, if we were as technologically capable now or had a BlackBerry or iPhone or what have you, I'd still be in Tehran. And I say this, Mike, of elected officials, particularly in Ottawa, not only in Ottawa, but Toronto, is an elected official, a minister, would like to know everything. And then, of course, inevitably, Mike, they have a view, which you welcome. That's what you're elected to office for. But however, if you're in Tehran in a sensitive situation, you just as well don't welcome any advice or interpretation from Ottawa, in the sense that we would have been bombarded 24 hours a day, I'm sure, with the best will in the world about what to do, but what are you doing now, but what are you thinking of next? Right. Whereas in Tehran at that time, the telephone didn't work, which was good. The only means of communication was through a cipher, which you could read if you wanted or not read, or maybe destroy it before you read it. But although the interconnectedness, as we talk about, the globalization today of the world makes it a different game entirely. Sometimes you think back and maybe those simpler days were easier.
What do you think of Canada closing our embassy there?
I think that was a mistake. The British don't have a presence. The Americans are long gone. And unless there's something that I'm not aware of in terms of the Canadians were in jeopardy, maybe the press release doesn't suggest that. It seems to me that diplomacy, and that's what a diplomat does, is just as important, if not more important, in a country where you've got an adversarial relationship than one you're friendly with. And if there is, if you can say, a regional superpower in the region, in the Middle East, it's going to be Iran or Turkey. Egypt's going to take a while. So this is where you want a presence. And the fact that you can't have access to government ministers really doesn't matter, because they wouldn't tell you the truth in any event. So you look at, you have other sources, you're listing post, life is difficult, at days it's frustrating, but that's where you want the embassy, when you're facing a difficult situation with a country that is in the headlines every day of the week.
But what are we going to, again, listening to Hillary Clinton yesterday and John Kerry again this morning in his confirmation hearing, talking about how we are going to deal with these parts of the world, and we're all debating Mali today and wondering what went on in Algeria and how that could all happen. We can't continue to fight wars on every front. Nobody can afford it. The U.S. is facing huge fiscal crisis. They're going to cut defense. Yet we've got a country like Iran run by shrewd, smart, but crazy and dangerous people who may have their hands on nuclear weaponry.
Well,
is Ken Taylor collecting information on the ground really going to fix that?
well, my ambitions are unlimited. No, I have no answer to that. Realistically, Pamela, of course, there's not much you can do there. But however, intelligence is only fragmented. You put together the picture eventually. And I think it would be useful for the Great Britain, for the United States, to have, not only for Canadian interests, but to have an embassy presence in the region. Now, of course, the government could make a valid argument otherwise. With respect to Iran, talked about that, of course, it's headline news daily. And now it's taken a bit of a different slant, I think, after the Israeli elections this week. It's difficult to say how the coalition is going to stand with respect not only to the settlements, but also with respect to Prime Minister Netanyahu's threats last year to, one way or the other, bombard Iran. With respect to bombarding Iran, I think it would be absolutely catastrophic. It would set back their program only a couple of years. It would, if there's any lack of cohesion among the Iranians themselves, I think that would cement them around maybe some of the more extreme elements in Iran. And there are other elements in Iran other than extreme. So, but it's the variable I think everybody here must seize is this. Would you take the option of bombing Iran in the threat of them securing a bomb? Or would you allow the Iranians to develop their own bomb? Now, not much of a case has been made that it may not be a catastrophic situation for Iran to have a bomb. On the other hand, there's a good case could be made that the Iranians are looking for capability to have a bomb. What they want is a virtual bomb. That is one that they can put together, and the world knows they can put it together, but they don't have it. They don't have to test it, and then they don't lose their place in the international specter of inspection. You have a case in Tehran that they're governed, of course, by self-interest and expediency, but at the same time, there's a status sense to Iran. They see themselves as a country of 2,500 years, 3,000. They're looking around, and there are nine countries now have the capability. They're looking around themselves, how about us? Now, you can say the leadership of Iran up until now has acted fairly irresponsibly, particularly with respect to their rhetorical viewpoint about Iran. So I think to some extent, the leadership is to blame for their own image. But I don't think the discussion's finished yet. We'll see, particularly in view that around this July, roughly, are selecting a new president. Right. And at that time, a very opaque country may be ready to display its own cards.
I want to talk about another issue that I alluded to at the beginning. When I went to New York as Canadian Consul General, of course, Ken embraced me and would take me to restaurants and say, this is the new ambassador to New York. And they would say, Mr. Ambassador Taylor, your successor. It's like nobody in the intervening 20 years had been there, because he was still the ambassador and still the hero of Tehran. I went to probably a half a dozen, some years a dozen events celebrating this man, the Americans remembering what he had done for them and what he had risked for them. And you've spent most of your adult life there since. You live in New York in the far Upper East Side with a great view of the East River, still remain a Canadian. And somehow it seems to me you're more a hero there than you are here. I worked a little bit in the Foreign Service. My sense is that we've got this in this country, and we see it in the movie business, we see it in all sorts of businesses, something called the tall poppy syndrome. That there you were, a hero in the world, everybody loved you, but were you just a little too big for your britches? Because at a certain point you left the Foreign Service and went into business, to Nabisco, and that was a great second career in your life and a great time. But I'm wondering whether there was some sense that that your hero status was un-Canadian in the minds of our own Foreign Service.
Well, I think Canadians are modest, unduly modest, and Canadians are reluctant to celebrate themselves. It's not much to do with me, but it's a certain Canadian characteristic that we find ourselves oftentimes in the middle of a thing, and that we don't mind that image to a large extent. Say The Economist magazine, of course, seems to have its eye on Canada in terms of defining this image, the great white melt. And of course, Canada's national color, beige.
That's right.
So it's a sort
nice,
of
friendly helper neighbors.
Yes. And I think this is, to some extent, some of the throes of conscience that Canadians are going through at the moment as they see peacekeeping involved into something quite different. And this doesn't seem to quite fit to, in some people's mind, the Canadian character.
Their own self-image. Do you regret leaving and making that change and making New York your home in any way?
No, I think if you've traveled abroad, borders don't mean much. Sure, there are administrative issues at the border, but particularly if you've lived abroad a lot of your life, and the similarities between the United States and Canada are certainly there. In fact, I think given Toronto's dynamic nature, pretty soon New York will be known as Toronto South. But it's life goes on, and I think that at that time I just wanted to change, and I thought I'd try to get a job elsewhere, and fortunately that eventually I did. And living in the U.S., I'm still a Canadian citizen. That doesn't change. I get up to Toronto frequently, and again, New York is a city that really defies national identity. I think to some extent it's similar to a city that Toronto is becoming, and I can feel quite Canadian in New York, quite insignificant among 8 million people. But I'm very much at ease. I like the change. I like to work with people I didn't know. I like to work with people whose expectations are rather cloudy. But we're happily there still.
And still very much a hero. I know we've got a couple of microphones out in the audience, so I do want to give people, there's a beautiful young woman who has one there and another right there. So just indicate, put your hands up if you would like to ask the ambassador a question. I've got a million, but then again, I see him all the time, so I can make him answer me, at lunch or dinner. Any comments, any questions that people would like to embrace and engage at this point? There's one gentleman there, a lady there, if we can get close. And just please tell us who you are.
Yes, my name is Randy Barber, and good day to both of you, and it's been an extremely interesting talk so far. I'm wondering, former Ambassador Taylor, unfortunately in Canada you don't carry the title any longer, but I wanted to ask you, as a great admirer of Sir Winston Churchill, whether or not the Churchillian psyche, if I may call it that, has anything to do with the way you thought and the way you've carried on your job up to this point.
Well, I think Churchill is his image and what he left behind is going to be of centuries length. I think that he expressed the thought, and that Canadians certainly answer this in some way, that you're bold, and that's one characteristic, I think, of Canada, Great Britain to a large extent. Again, he never conceded that he was ever going to lose the game. And I think those two aspects, that you have to take a chance, and that in the back of your mind you probably know that it's going to work out okay in the long run. And certainly that was the intent, I think, when he spoke to the House of Commons and said we're not going to be defeated.
There's a gentleman right there. Is it close? Go ahead.
Thank you. I'm curious about the truth of the depiction of the escape of the Americans from the Canadian Embassy as portrayed in the movie. Whether, in fact, there was a movie ostensibly being made, a CIA agent coming over to rescue the hostages, and how much of what was portrayed in the movie, which was certainly very exciting, was actually true.
And about 20 minutes later, he tried to get out of town, too. Okay, just to take a few minutes.
I thought it was exciting, too, actually. I found it more exciting than the real thing. No, it's a movie. And if you read Tony Mendez's book, Tony Mendez is a CIA agent who was in Tehran for a day and a half, 2 days. He wrote a book, and
read Ben Affleck in the movie. Okay.
Ben Affleck, of course, yes. And in his book, he said that the departure went very smoothly. And such as it did, because there'd been a lot of preparation. The last thing we wanted after having them there 3 months was to blow it at the airport. So the embassy obtained 3 tickets for each one on Swiss Air, one on SAS, and one on M.B.A, just in case one of them broke down. And then we also said that if you're troubled by getting through the immigration, just say you'll travel another day and come back to our house. So they had a backup situation. And then their Canadian identity papers were faultlessly done in Ottawa. They did ask a bit about the movie, but not really. They could have been doing anything as long as they were Canadians, and they stamped it. The interrogation in the movie didn't take place. The chase down the runway with the police cars, the 747, as I said, I was on the edge of my seat. Really didn't happen. They went through immigration. It tested their courage. It was nerve-wracking for them to do it, but at the same time they did it with class, and they managed to find themselves on the airplane. I think the one moment of truth in the movie, however, is once they passed out of Iranian airspace, is I'm sure they drank something stronger than champagne.
How did you and Pat leave?
We left, Pat left the night before to Paris. I stayed around with Sergeant Gauthier, one of the MPs, military police officer. And we had to, and as David remembers, you've got this huge cipher machine the size of a ping pong table, and that had to be destroyed. I tried to lift up the sledgehammer. Said to Sergeant Gauthier, big guy, picked up the sledgehammer with one hand and destroyed the cipher machine. From then on, his name is Sledge Gauthier.
Is there one more question we can do right here? Go ahead. She's right behind you, go ahead.
Thank you, Ambassador. My name is Eileen Carroll, and I listened with great applause to hear you say or give your thoughts regarding the closing of the Canadian Embassy in Tehran and I fully concur with your point of view. As we watch our diplomacy become less and less nuanced, perhaps a little bit more black and white, do you foresee a propensity on the part of the current government to continue to shut down embassies where they feel threatened or that have become trouble spots?
I probably won't comment on that, so you go ahead. Yeah.
I think past a certain point, yes, you have to close, for instance, in Mali at the moment. And I think they're seriously thinking, most countries, of closing down those who have a consulate in Benghazi. Comes a point where you just can't operate. I always see diplomacy as a very ambiguous issue. Diplomacy is very gray. What's right and what's wrong ethically may be very clear, but what's right and what's wrong in a country's own self-interest is a debatable point. Summing up really that the question which is perceptive is Canada's future is beyond its borders. The idea that a country of 33 million people can sustain itself without having a strong international presence is a myth. And I hope in one way, I'm not suggesting it's the one way or the one avenue, but contributing to that is a Canadian presence overseas. Whether it be a Canadian embassy, whether it be a very invigorated Canadian export community, whether it be the newspapers who sustain a foreign presence with some journalists, whether it be the church, tourists or what have you. The beyond the border is, I think, is a good byline for Canadians to search for.
One quick final question. Go ahead.
I just want to say, Senator Wallin, I disagree with you a little bit about Ambassador Taylor not being a hero in this country. He is very much. But we carry our pride, maybe with a smaller megaphone, but nonetheless, he will always be the ambassador to us.
Exactly. I want to... If you'll indulge me just a moment, I do want to give my personal and formal thanks to Ambassador Taylor, because as someone who went into New York as Consul General after 9/11, where that longest undefended border in the world was at peril, really, in terms of being shut down. We didn't know what to do. We didn't know how to do trade across a border without security. We were discussing a larger security net that would include Canada and the US. Canada had concerns about its identity and its sovereignty, and we were really in a very tough situation. 87% of everything we made and created and sold went into the United States of America. And because of the goodwill that this man created 30 years earlier, we actually, as diplomats of the day, following in your wake, had something to work with, and were able to really turn that relationship into something where we could salvage, build on, and improve. And we are talking about the Beyond the Borders deals today and making it a little more reasonable. But without the role of Ken Taylor in more than 33 years ago this month, that would have been a much harder row to hoe, and Canada and America remain friends and partners today. And as Canadians, we need to thank you very much.
Stay up here for a second. Please welcome Jerry McCarville, CEO of Nabisco Resources, to thank our guests.
Well, thank you very much. You should take this show on the road, both of you, and I'd suggest that you start in Hollywood. That might be the most appropriate place. And just by the by, one of my colleagues was not mentioned over here, Miller O'Prey, who's the president of Solvista, one of our gold mining companies down in South America. And if you want to hang around for a couple of hours after, he'll give you a course in that. Mr. President, distinguished head table guests, fellow members and guests of the Empire Club of Canada, I have the pleasure to express our formal thanks to our two key speakers, Ambassador Ken Taylor and Senator Pamela Wallin. And as I say again, I had a dent here. You might want to take this show on the road. Ken and Pamela, you're both Canadian patriots. We're all very proud of you and what you've accomplished. You're both doers, and that's what success is all about in any walk of life. You get up in the morning with a plan and a mission to carry it out. Having a plan doesn't mean it's going to happen. Persistence makes the plan happen. As we go through a long list of of accomplishments of both of you, you can see persistence at every turn. In Canada, we do not value our leaders and heroes enough. When people do things like you do out of the ordinary for your country and for others, they should be recognized. And therefore, this group here today do recognize your achievements and say thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you, Jerry. As a token of our appreciation on behalf of the Empire Club, I'd like to present both Ken and Pamela with a copy of Who Said That? It's a selection of quotes and notes from 110 years of the Empire Club speeches.
That's wonderful. Thank you.
Senator. Thank you. Finally, each of you should have at your seat a list of upcoming events. I'm pleased to let you know that we have an amazing lineup of guests and speakers. On Thursday, January 31st, please join us for Ian Russell, President and CEO of the Investment Industry Association of Canada. On February 5th, it says sold out here, but I understand there may be a few tables left. Please join us for Thorsten Heinz, the CEO of Research in Motion. We'll have over 500 people at that event. I'd like to thank Providential Pictures and Norvista Resources for sponsoring our event today. And I'd also like to thank the Pegasus Group of companies for sponsoring our student table. Thank you, Terry. I'd like to thank the National Post as our print media sponsor. This meeting will be carried and aired on Rogers TV. We're very grateful to Rogers for their ongoing support. It's easy to become a member of the Empire Club, and you can find us on our website at www.empireclub.org. We're also on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you all for coming. We look forward to seeing you soon. This meeting is now adjourned.